The silence of the house was a heavy, suffocating blanket, disturbed only by the thin, ragged breaths of his daughters. Owen pressed his forehead against the frosted window pane, the cold a welcome sting against his feverish skin. Outside, the world had vanished, erased by a dizzying onslaught of white. The blizzard had been howling for 3 days, a relentless predator clawing at the walls of his small ranch house, isolating him in a universe of snow and fear. He was running out of firewood, the salt pork was nearly gone, and the fever that had claimed 2 of his sheep was now settled deep in the chests of Rose, Lily, and Daisy. They lay huddled together in the big bed, their small faces flushed, their identical braids of pale hair fanned out on the pillow like dormant rays of a forgotten sun. He was a man of the land, capable and strong, but this was a fight he didn't know how to win. Grief was a poor substitute for medicine, and loneliness offered no warmth. His wife Martha would have known what to do. She would have had remedies simmering on the stove, her calm presence a fortress against any storm. But Martha was gone, and the silence she left behind was louder than the wind. He felt a familiar, crushing despair settle in his chest, the weight of his own inadequacy. He was failing them. He was failing her memory. It was in that moment of utter surrender, when the howl of the wind seemed to be mocking his very existence, that he heard it. A sound so faint, so utterly impossible, he thought his mind had finally cracked. A soft, rhythmic tapping at the door. He froze, listening, certain it was just the wind playing tricks, a branch scraping against the wood. But it came again, more insistent this time. A knock. Someone was out there, out in the white death that had swallowed the horizon. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, his heart hammering against his ribs, and moved towards the door, his mind racing through all the terrible possibilities. He threw the bolt, the sound unnaturally loud in the strained quiet, and pulled the heavy door inward. A gust of wind and ice crystals blasted into the room, making the fire sputter and the girls stir weakly in their sleep. And there, framed against the swirling chaos of the storm, stood a woman. She was small, delicate, and looked as if the wind might tear her from the earth at any moment. She wore a simple, high-collared dress of gray wool, a style he had never seen before, its dark color a stark contrast to the blinding white all around her. A vibrant red scarf was wrapped around her head and neck, the only spot of defiant color in the monochrome landscape. Snow clung to her eyelashes and the fine black hair that had escaped her scarf, and her face was pale with an exhaustion so profound it seemed carved into her bones. But her eyes, dark and deep, held a flicker of fierce determination. In her arms, clutched to her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world, was a loaf of bread. It was wrapped in cloth, and from it radiated a faint, impossible warmth. She swayed on her feet, her strength finally giving out. "Please," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound, almost lost to the wind. "Shelter." Owen stood motionless for a heartbeat, stunned by the sheer improbability of her. A ghost, a snow spirit, a hallucination born of grief and desperation. Then he saw the slight tremor in her hands, the blue tint to her lips, and the man in him, the husband and father, took over. He reached out, his large, calloused hand closing around her thin arm, and gently pulled her inside, out of the storm's unforgiving embrace. He kicked the door shut against the raging wind, plunging the room into the dim, flickering light of the hearth. The woman leaned against the closed door, her eyes fluttering shut as she slid slowly to the floor, the precious loaf of bread rolling gently from her lap onto the rough-hewn planks. The storm raged on, its fury a constant low growl that vibrated through the very foundations of the cabin. But inside, a new, fragile quiet began to take hold. Owen carried the woman to the hearth and settled her on the worn rug, propping her head with a rolled-up blanket. He chafed her frozen hands between his own, the skin like ice against his, until a faint touch of warmth returned. He ladled a mug of thin broth, all he had left, and held it to her lips, coaxing her to drink. Slowly, life seeped back into her. Color returned to her cheeks, and the deep, soul-weary exhaustion in her eyes was replaced by a watchful awareness. She told him her name was Leanne, and that she had come from the railway workers' camp a few miles east, a place he knew of but had never visited. Her husband had been an engineer, but an illness had taken him swiftly a month prior, and with the blizzard cutting the camp off, the foreman had told the few remaining families to fend for themselves. She had been trying to reach the town of Redemption, a fool's errand in this weather, when she saw the faint smudge of smoke from his chimney. Owen listened, his own sorrow a quiet echo to hers. He explained about his daughters, the fever, his wife Martha. He spoke her name with a reverence that was almost painful. "She passed giving birth to our son," he said, his voice rough. "We lost him too." He didn't know why he was telling this stranger his deepest wounds, but the shared space of survival seemed to demand honesty. Leanne didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply nodded, her gaze falling on the three small forms in the bed, and a profound, sorrowful understanding passed between them. The loaf of bread which he had placed on the small table became the centerpiece of their strange, storm-forged communion. It was a miracle, a testament to her will to live, and it was the first real food he and his girls would have in days. As the second day of her presence bled into a third, a subtle transformation began within the four walls of the cabin. The world outside remained a howling vortex of snow, but inside, Leanne began to weave a quiet magic of order and care. She moved with an economy of motion, her presence calming rather than intrusive. She found his dwindling supply of potatoes and onions and created a fragrant, savory soup that was more than just sustenance. It was a promise of recovery. She tore strips from one of her own clean undergarments to make cool compresses for the girls' foreheads, her touch infinitely gentle as she smoothed their hair and whispered soft, unintelligible words that sounded like a lullaby from a distant land. Owen watched her, a silent, humbled observer. He was a man who knew how to tame horses and mend fences, how to read the sky and predict the seasons, but the gentle arts of the hearth had always been Martha's domain. He had been trying to fill shoes that were impossibly large and had been failing at every turn. Leanne did not try to fill them. She simply walked her own path, and in doing so, brought a light back into the shadowed corners of his home. He found himself moving in rhythm with her, chopping the last of the firewood with a renewed vigor, ensuring the fire never faltered, hauling in buckets of snow to melt for water. They worked around each other in a near-silent partnership, their communication consisting of small gestures and brief, practical exchanges. "The fever is breaking on the smallest one," she would say, and he would nod, his heart lifting with a hope he hadn't dared to feel. "There's more wood behind the barn," he would tell her, and she would give a small, grateful smile. The triplets, emerging from their fevered haze, began to watch her with wide, curious blue eyes. Daisy, always the boldest, reached out a small hand one afternoon and shyly touched the sleeve of Leanne's gray dress, a silent question and a plea all in one. Days melted into a week, the storm refusing to relinquish its hold on the high plains. The cabin became their entire world, a small, warm island in a sea of frozen fury. The rhythm of their life was dictated by the needs of the children and the demands of survival, but beneath it, a deeper current was forming. Trust was being built not with words, but with actions. It was in the way Leanne managed to mend a tear in Lily's favorite nightgown with thread she painstakingly unraveled from a sack. It was in the way she saved the best part of the broth for Owen, knowing he worked the hardest keeping them warm. For his part, Owen found himself anticipating her needs. He noticed the way she shivered slightly in the evenings and began leaving his heaviest wool blanket draped over the chair she favored by the fire. He saw her worn-out shoes and spent an afternoon carefully rubbing them with tallow to waterproof them, a quiet, practical gift. The triplets became the bridge between them. They had been withdrawn and listless, lost in their grief and illness, but Leanne's gentle presence slowly coaxed them out of their shells. She taught them how to fold paper into delicate shapes of birds and flowers, a craft from her homeland that mesmerized them. Rose, the quietest, began to follow her everywhere, a small, silent shadow. One evening, as Leanne was humming her strange, beautiful lullaby to them, Lily looked up at her with sleepy eyes and whispered, "It sounds like Mama's songs." Leanne's hand stilled on her hair for a moment, and she looked over at Owen, her dark eyes filled with a complex emotion he couldn't quite name. He simply met her gaze and gave a slow, grateful nod. In that shared look, an entire conversation took place, one of loss, of memory, and of the unexpected grace that was blooming in the heart of the storm. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the soft sounds of recovery, of quiet industry, and of 3 little girls beginning to heal. The fire cast a warm, dancing glow across the room, painting the walls in shades of orange and gold. The children were asleep, their breathing deep and even for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The wind outside had quieted to a low moan, a tired beast finally admitting defeat. In the peaceful aftermath, a different kind of silence settled between Owen and Leanne, one that was no longer born of necessity or caution, but of a growing, comfortable intimacy. Leanne was carefully mending one of Owen's shirts by the firelight, her needle moving with a practiced, hypnotic grace. Owen sat across from her, watching her hands, the way the light caught the smooth, dark gloss of her hair. "You never speak of him," he said softly, breaking the quiet. "Your husband." Leanne paused her sewing, her hands resting in her lap. She stared into the flames for a long moment before she spoke, her voice low and steady. "His name was Way. He was a good man, a scholar. He loved books more than anything. He saw beauty in numbers and the stars." She smiled a sad, gentle smile. "This land was too hard for him. He was not built for it. But he came here for me, to build a life for us. He died trying." She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and he saw the profound depth of her loss, a grief as vast and lonely as his own. The vulnerability in her gaze gave him the courage to offer his own. "Martha loved to laugh," he said, the memory feeling sharp and sweet. "She could find the joy in anything. A new calf, the first spring flower. She made this house bright. When she died, all the color went out of the world." He looked down at his own hands, calloused and empty. "I haven't known what to do without her. I've just been getting through the days, until the storm, until you." The confession hung in the air between them, simple, honest, and heavy with unspoken meaning. Leanne set aside her sewing, and her gaze was soft with an empathy that soothed the raw edges of his soul. "We are not meant to be alone in our sorrow, Owen." The days that followed were filled with a strange, suspended peace. The snow had stopped falling, and a profound stillness had fallen over the land, the world outside muffled and pristine under its thick white blanket. They knew the thaw would come, that the road to town would eventually be cleared, but neither of them spoke of it. The cabin had become a sanctuary, and the thought of the outside world intruding felt like a violation. The bond between them, forged in crisis and tempered in shared grief, had deepened into something tender and unspoken. It existed in the small, unconscious gestures of domesticity, the way he now automatically passed her the tin cup she favored, the way she knew exactly how he liked his coffee, a habit she'd learned from watching him. The romantic turning point came not with a grand declaration, but in a moment of quiet, unassuming grace. Leanne had been standing by the window, looking out at the endless expanse of white, a wistful expression on her face. Owen came to stand beside her, following her gaze. The setting sun was breaking through the clouds for the first time, painting the snow in hues of rose and lavender. "It is beautiful," she whispered, more to herself than to him, "in its own way." "It's a hard beauty," he replied, his voice low. He felt an overwhelming urge to keep her there, to keep this peace, this warmth she had brought into his life, from melting away with the snow. He saw the faint goosebumps on her arms, and, without thinking, he reached out and gently drew his thick wool blanket from the back of a nearby chair and draped it around her shoulders. His fingers brushed against the nape of her neck, a brief electric touch. She turned her head, her dark eyes wide and searching, and he didn't pull away. He let his hand rest on her shoulder, a simple, grounding weight. The space between them shimmered with a new energy, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Leanne," he began, his voice barely a whisper, not knowing what he was going to say, only that he had to say something. She simply looked at him, a universe of understanding in her gaze, and gave the slightest of nods, accepting the gesture, accepting the unspoken promise it held. The world returned with the sound of crunching snow and the cheerful call of a familiar voice. "Owen, you in there? You alive?" It was Dr. Miller, his round face red from the cold, his horse steaming behind him. He had ridden out from Redemption as soon as the drifts were passable, expecting the worst. Owen opened the door to a world that was painfully bright, the sun reflecting off the snow with a blinding intensity. The doctor pushed his way inside, his bag in hand, his eyes quickly taking in the scene. He stopped short, his gaze moving from the three girls, awake and sitting up in bed, their cheeks pink with health instead of fever, to the tidy cabin, the simmering pot on the stove, and finally to the quiet woman in the gray dress who stood by the hearth, a protective hand resting on Daisy's shoulder. A look of profound surprise, followed by one of deep understanding, crossed his face. He looked from Leanne back to Owen, a slow smile spreading beneath his thick mustache. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice full of gruff warmth. "I rode out here fearing I'd be digging graves. Instead, it looks like a home." He examined the girls, declaring them weak but on the mend, his praise for their care evident. "Whoever nursed these girls did a fine job indeed." His eyes kept flicking back to Leanne, his approval a tangible thing in the small room. He saw not a stranger, but a caregiver, a presence that belonged. As he was leaving, he clapped Owen on the shoulder, his voice lowered confidentially. "You hold on to that one, son," he said, nodding towards Leanne. "Providence doesn't send miracles like that into a blizzard for no reason." The doctor's words were a public affirmation of what Owen already knew in his heart. Leanne hadn't just saved them from the storm. She had rescued them from the cold, silent life they had been living. She was the miracle he hadn't even known how to pray for. After Dr. Miller's visit, the reality of their situation settled upon them. The path to town was open. The world was waiting. Leanne's reason for staying had vanished with the storm. The next morning, Owen watched in silent misery as she began to gather her few belongings. She folded her spare undergarment and tucked it into a small cloth bundle. She took her red scarf from the hook by the door where it had been drying. The splash of color that had become a fixture in the room was about to disappear, and the thought of the cabin returning to its drab, lonely state was more than he could bear. The girls watched too, their small faces a mask of confusion and impending heartbreak. Rose stood by the door, her hand on the frame, as if she could physically block the exit. Leanne paused, her back to him, her hand holding the red scarf. He knew that if he didn't speak now, the silence would claim him again, perhaps for good. "Don't," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. Don't pack that. He took a step towards her, his heart pounding a desperate rhythm against his ribs. Leanne, this place, before you came, it was just a shelter. 4 walls to keep the wind out. It wasn't a home, not since Martha. He gestured around the room at the mended clothes, the clean floor, the lingering scent of wholesome food. You did this. You brought the life back into it. You brought the life back into us. He looked at his daughters, their wide, pleading eyes fixed on Leanne. Look at them. They're healing because of you. He finally met her gaze, laying his own heart bare. I'm not asking you to be a housekeeper. I'm asking you to stay. Stay and build a life with us. Let this be your home too. He held his breath, the future of his entire world resting on her answer. Leanne's gaze shifted from his face to the anxious faces of the 3 little girls. A slow, beautiful smile transformed her features, wiping away the last traces of weariness and sorrow. She walked to the stone mantelpiece above the hearth, and deliberately, carefully, she laid her red scarf across it. The vibrant slash of color against the gray stone was a declaration, a promise, a final answer. 5 summers later, the ranch was a portrait of abundance. The small cabin Owen had built with his own hands had been lovingly expanded, a new wing reaching out to embrace the morning sun. Where there had once been only hard-packed dirt and struggling grass, a vibrant garden now flourished, bursting with corn, beans, and bright-faced sunflowers that turned their heads to follow the day. Rose, Lily, and Daisy, now on the cusp of womanhood, moved through the rows, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze as they helped Leanne harvest vegetables for their evening meal. Their pale hair, once a symbol of their shared fragility, now shone like spun gold in the sunlight, a testament to years of health and happiness. Owen leaned against the fence post, watching them. A deep, abiding contentment settled in his soul. The harsh lines of grief that had once been etched around his eyes had softened into laugh lines. He walked towards the garden, his steps sure and steady, and came to stand beside Leanne. She looked up at him, her face glowing, and he slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. The gray dress had long been replaced by practical calico, but the memory of it, and the red scarf, remained a cornerstone of their family's story. A small boy of 4, with Owen's sturdy build and Leanne's dark, intelligent eyes, toddled out of the house and ran towards them, his small arms outstretched. Owen swept him up, settling the child on his hip. His son, Wei, named for the scholar his mother had loved, a bridge between 2 worlds, 2 lives. Leanne rested her head on Owen's shoulder as they watched their daughters. "Do you remember," she said softly, "how quiet it was?" Owen nodded, tightening his hold. "I remember the silence," he said. "And then I remember the sound of you knocking on the door." Every winter, when the first snows fell, they would gather by the fire, and he would tell the children the story of the great blizzard, of a house full of sickness and despair, and of the brave woman who walked out of the storm with a loaf of bread, a miracle of hope that had saved them all. It was their founding myth, the beginning of everything. Looking at his family, bathed in the golden light of a perfect summer afternoon, Owen knew he was the richest man in the world.